Can you speak to the accuracy of the financial statements of the world's major financial institutions? What should be done to properly value their assets?
Well, it's a very tough thing. I still lean strongly. There's a lot of controversy now about whether you should use fair value, however that may be determined. And in many cases, it's very hard to determine. But whether you should use that or some other figure like cost, because people say that the present values are unrepresentative and so on. I think that you get into more trouble as a society when you start openly valuing things at prices that make no sense in terms of what's going on, than whether you do your best to estimate them, even though those estimates may prove in many cases optimistic later on and certainly inaccurate in some respects. So I would stick with financial institutions at least having to attempt to report their assets on a fair value basis. But when you get into instruments, I've used this illustration before, but when you get into a CDO squared, if you read a standard mortgage, residential mortgage-backed certificate security, it may consist of thousands of mortgages backing up this instrument. And then that instrument may be tranched into 30 or so different tranches where each party has a different claim on the waterfall of funds received. Now, that instrument itself can be kind of difficult to understand. But then you take that and you create a CDO by taking some of the lower junior tranches of a bunch of these RMBSs, maybe 50 of them. And then you create a CDO out of this. So now you create out of a whole bunch of junior and perhaps very correlated and perhaps kind of lousy instruments, and then you put them in a CDO and say that because you put them all together and diversified in theory, you got a lot of AAA tranches of that, was a big error to start with. And then when you took the lower tranches of a bunch of CDOs and stuck them into a CDO squared, that was nuttiness squared. And if a residential mortgage-backed security had a 300-page prospectus and you had to read 50 of those to understand the CDO, you're up to 15,000 pages. And if you had to read 50 more CDO prospectuses and the material behind that to evaluate a CDO squared, you had to read 750,000 pages, presumably, to evaluate one security. And that was madness. To let people value that sort of thing because they say the market at 10 cents on the dollar is unrepresentative, so instead of using that, I'll use the 100 cents I paid, I think would be an abomination. And I think that the discipline, mild as it may be, of telling managements that you're going to have to value this stuff at market may keep them from doing things that they would otherwise do that would be very stupid if they think they can get away with valuing them at some fictitious, or at cost, which would be fictitious in terms of market. So I lean toward the market value approach. I don't know. When you get into really complex instruments, I just don't know how you value them. Charlie was on the audit committee at Solomon, and they would spend hours and hours and hours. And I think you found one that was mismarked by 20 million or something like that, back when 20 million was real money.
It was the floating plug.
Well, we had the floating plug too, yeah.
Yeah, no, there's a lot that goes on in the bowels of American industry that is not pretty.
So you can add the sausage and laws. Maybe you should add accounting practices of things that people shouldn't have to witness the making of.
I think that part of the trouble comes from some prominent members of my own Republican Party. Some of these people overdosed on Ayn Rand and what they learned in Economics 101, and they sort of got to thinking that if anything happened as a natural response of human nature in a free market system, even if it was an axe murder, it was a desirable development and part of a wise distribution of risk. I don't know why grown-ups get these silly ideas, but they do. And One of them headed the Federal Reserve. I think Alan Greenspan did a very good job, averaged out, but he did overdose a little on Ayn Rand. And he had this tendency to believe that if it happened in a free market, it had to be all right. I think there's some things that should be forbidden. And I think that the world would have worked better if a lot of things that were described as follows. This is a financial innovation which will diversify risk. If that phrase had been banned from all discourse, the country would have worked better.